Excellencies, dear participants, I apologize, my lecture is in English. It's only possible to speak in German or in Italian or in English. Ne kalbu lietuviškai. Bet suprantu truputį. Therefore, I beg your pardon that I have to speak in a language that I know what I say. And I beg your pardon because I have changed a little, that's my opinion, I have changed a little the topic. The topic of in 20 minutes, 25 minutes, is faith, reason, and relativism in the thought of Joseph Ratzinger and Pope Benedict. It's a little larger, because then I feel me much more secure. The topic faith, reason, and relativism is of great relevance today, a time where politics are increasingly taking on religious forms, and the dimensions of faith become more and more political. Currently, there is a tendency to believe in politics, while the preaching of the Church increasingly tends to focus on political issues. Relativism, which already dominates large parts of public life, further adds to this confusion, leaving not only society but also believers feeling unsettled. Against this background, it is worth recalling the words of Cardinal Ratzinger, which resonated around the world 20 years ago. During the Holy Mass that marked the beginning of the conclave held in 2005, he spoke about the great danger posed by relativism. In this context, he quoted the epistle of the Ephesians when he described being tossed by waves and swept along by every wind of teaching. Freely translated, we could say that everything is permitted, yet we are compelled to remain indifferent toward the truth, especially the revealed truth. This inevitably leads to the erosion and ultimately the destruction of a faith based on the confession of truth. And this leads to a poisoning of faith. As remedy, Ratzinger once again reminded the Church of his greatness, beauty, and importance of truth. And the following aims to show from the perspective of Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, why it is in keeping with the dignity of reason to be orientated toward truth, and why, in the end, only the truth will set us free. In this way, important insights are offered that help us to understand why neither the Church nor the world can endure when detached from the truth. Faith and reason is a constant theme of Ratzinger's work. Already in the early years of his scientific activity, he understood the crucial importance of the interplay between faith and reason, as well as the need for a correct understanding of both. When reason or faith wither away, they inevitably lead to pathologies and to the disintegration of human person. Joseph Ratzinger was an attentive observer of the current development of this time. As early as 1961, he identified two major challenges: the belief in technological progress and globalization. And he also observed the emergence of a technical monoculture, clearly evident in today's dependence on social communication media. A kind of universal spiritual language, which today is English, and which marks the world's entry into a new stage of uniformity. Due to this changed situation, there soon was a call to respond to it. This, in turn, called for new forms of proclamation, liturgy, and teaching. Science began to be endowed with an almost religious meaning, one that, through the rise of the technocratic monoculture, threatened to absorb everything else. Traditional faith, based on divine revelation, was met with increasing skepticism. Furthermore, the outstanding cultural heritage of the Western world was undermined by relativism, the experience of globalization and standardization. Novelty was welcomed with exuberant joy. The commitment to truth played an increasingly minor role, with practice and progress setting the tone. Many, including a large number of theologians, could not resist to the temptation to be like everyone else. Reason was allegedly upheld, and a scientific approach was embraced. And yet, paradoxically, reason itself was denied its capacity to apprehend the truth. Before the Second Vatican Council, Joseph Ratzinger had outlined this development more than 50 years ago in detail, pointing to a process that would fundamentally alter the way modern humanity perceives reality. The immediacy of nature and thus of reality is lost. Everything is perceived through the filter of technology. How very true this analysis has proven to be. These remarks show how radically perception was changed in modern times. Truth is no longer defined by its conformity to reality, but rather by its feasibility. This fateful decoupling makes people susceptible to manipulation, a process that is further exacerbated by the digital world. Partly responsible for this is a self-imposed limitation of reason, which is no longer able to take its measure from being, from the Logos. In his book, Introduction to Christianity, Joseph Ratzinger outlined this development in a very convincing way. A turning point was reached. Now, technical thinking had taken over, and faith, so it was claimed, had given way to science. And the Marxist axiom gained the upper hand, according to which practice became the guiding criterion, while everything else had to be subordinated to it, including teaching. Thus, in the name of progress and scientific rigor, it was not uncommon to justify things that were neither progressive nor scientific. The following example may illustrate this. Under the guise of being scientific, a claim was made to replace faith with knowledge and to close the bridge to the world. As a result, supernatural revelation lost its significance as a reference point for theology, being increasingly replaced by secular sciences. This led to a process that can be described as a reversal of all values. no longer was divine revelation the reference point, but rather the principles of an immanent science, which were soon replaced by the concrete living conditions of man. Reason became confined to the here and now, and thus ultimately its capacity to grasp the truth was denied. Joseph Ratzinger summarized this development as follows, I quote, "The truth human beings deal with is neither the truth of being nor ultimately that its past deeds, but rather the truth of changing the world, of shaping the world, a truth related to the future and to action." The end of the quotation. A self-restricted reason is incapable of elevating the spirit to God. And in the early 1960s, Ratzinger warned that this would lead to an alienation from the most original sources of religious existence. And he said, "Thus, instead of the one true God, may false gods arose, the worship of the work instead of the one who made it. Thus, technical religio, that is, the worship of man for himself, automatically takes the place of natural religion. The self-deification of humanity replaces the deification of nature, which inner necessity. Ultimately, man and nature are deified. Man, who by his nature, as Augustine says, is oriented towards God, is thus deprived of his natural ability and rendered incapable of reaching God. And since he commits himself to immanence, he is unable to recognize and love him. The only way out is relativism, which is the result of a weak reasoning." And based on these early insights, Ratzinger continues, I quote, "But this also means that the new paganism, which for a century has developed in the heart of the Christian world, is fundamentally different from the earlier one. There are no more gods. Instead, the world has been irrevocably divinized and profaned. Only human remains on the scene, and they now feel a kind of religious reverence for themselves, or at least for a part of humanity, to which we owe our technological progress." End of quotation. Worse than the profane is a reduction of reason which can, at best, only rotate around itself because it has been deprived of the ability to elevate itself to the supernatural. Instead, human beings and concrete living conditions take center stage. Man becomes the measure of all things. The measure of the divine is lost. The problem is that this process is very subtle. The self-restraint of reason is hardly perceived as such, and on the contrary, invoking science brings a sense of reassurance. The consequences become most apparent in a disturbed function of spiritual life. Today, many people turn to psychologists because their psyche, the soul, is ill. This fact clearly shows that something fundamental is wrong. For if reason has no access to God, then religious has no place in the realm of reason. Faith would become irrational or merely natural. The developments outlined by Ratzinger in his introduction to Christianity have far-reaching consequences. Due to the self-limitation of reason, access to the supernatural was denied. And as a result, faith was initially replaced by science and then by politics. This gave politics a religious dimension, while faith became more and more political. This development caused a rift between scientific political theology and the faith of ordinary believers, who increasingly turned away from it in order not to lose their faith. And this has created a huge divide, which is further widened by the fact that so-called scientific theologians ridicule the faith of ordinary believers and speak of it in a derogatory manner. In this regard, Pope Benedict was a true bridge builder. He tried to find a remedy because the faith of the simple is the true treasure of the Church. And he was convinced that something essential is missing when man is deprived of the truth. In his famous Regensburg lecture, he called for an expanded reason. It must free itself from self-limitation and regain its greatness which corresponds to man. And he said at the end of his lecture, I quote, "The West has long been endangered by the aversion to the questions which underline its rationality and can only suffer great harm thereby. The courage to engage the whole breadth of reason and not the denial of its grandeur, this is a program with which a theology grounded in biblical faith enters into the debates of our time. Not to act reasonably, not to act with logos is contrary to the nature of God, said Manuel II, according to his Christian understanding of God, in response to his Persian interlocutor. It is to this great logos, to this breadth of reason, that we invite our partners in the dialogue of cultures to rediscover it constantly in the great task of the university." End of the quotation. We can add that only when reason regains its greatness and breadth, even relativism can be overcome. What has been said about reason equally applies to faith. In recent decades, little importance has been given to faith, even in theology. Although theology is impossible without faith, even there, the so-called scientific approach has left traces of devastation, with theologians striving to replace faith with life, faith with science. Thus, faith is deprived of its supernatural character and reduced to a private matter, resulting in the banishment of faith from public life. And the effects of this disastrous misunderstanding of what theology is are becoming increasingly apparent today. As a result, fewer and fewer Christians know their faith. They have become, in effect, neo-pagans. What has now become a sad reality was already anticipated by Ratzinger in the 1960s. To describe this process, he drew on a Brother Grimm fairy tale, in German Hans im Glück, John and the Luck. In the foreword to his introduction to Christianity, he uses this story to illustrate how believers gradually drift away from their faith. The fairy tale tells the story of John, who, as payment for several years of work, receives a lump of gold. He gradually trades it away for less valuable things that seem more convenient to him. In the end, just before reaching home and his mother, he is left with only a grindstone, which he thrown into a well. Thus he ends up with nothing, but rejoices in his newfound freedom. Already in the 1960s, Ratzinger asked, have theology not gradually downplayed the demands of faith? Demands that were once felt as too burdensome. Step by step, always just enough so that nothing essential seemed lost, yet always enough to allow the next step to be taken. And will poor Hans, the Christian, who trustingly allowed himself to be led from one exchange to another, from one interpretation to the next, not soon find himself holding nothing but the grindstone instead of the gold he began with? A grindstone that he can be safely advised to throw away. And that is exactly what happened. The treasure of faith, which according to the Apostle Paul you carry in earthen vessels, has been lost by many, misled by theologians who have strayed from the truth of Christ. Joseph Ratzinger identifies this as a twofold problem characteristic for the modern era, which the following discussion will address. From early on, Ratzinger succeeded in identifying the fundamental difficulties in passing on faith in the modern age, the gap between visible and the invisible. Even though Christians in their creed, Sunday, profess their belief in the invisible world, this part of the creed seems to have been surpassed by modern scientific understanding, thus appearing unreal. Terms such as invisible and supernatural almost cry out for the demythologization. Ratzinger refers to the growing divide between the visible and the invisible as the primary scandalum of faith. Anyone who speaks of an invisible reality inevitably provokes contradiction. Yet revelation, the heart of our Christian faith, is precisely the manifestation of the invisible God. And Ratzinger describes this difficulty as follows. I quote, "Today we are inclined from the outset to simply assume that what is tangible, what is verifiable, is what is truly real. But is that actually allowed? Shouldn't we ask more carefully what the real actually is? Is it only what has been established and can be established? Or is establishing perhaps only a certain way of relating to reality, which by no means can grasp the whole and which even leads to a distortion of truth and human existence if we accept it as the sole determining factor? Christian faith, so Ratzinger, means the option that the unseen is more real than the seen. It is a confession to the primacy of the invisible as what is truly real, which sustains us and therefore enables us to face what is visible with relaxed serenity and in accountability to the invisible as the true foundations foundation of all things. End of the quotation. The following is worth noting. Whoever gives up the scandal of faith gives up the main through which the invisible world becomes visible. This highlights the dilemma in which large parts of theology still find themselves today. Strictly speaking, the alternative remains between abolishing faith in the name of faith or accepting the scandal of faith. An urgent correction in the spirit of Joseph Ratzinger is needed here. The inner logic and beauty of faith only come to bear when faith is accepted in his entirety, which undoubtedly includes the invisible world. And finally, attention should be focused to faith. Benedict XVI noted that when we talk about faith today, there is a fundamental difficulty. The problem with the word belief is that it refers to two completely different mental attitudes. In everyday language, to believe means to think, to suppose. It has a primary stage of knowledge in relation to things about which no certainty has yet been reached. But belief in God is neither a hypothesis or an assumption, nor a mere opinion, for no one would be willing to give their life for it as the martyrs did. And Ratzinger himself defines faith as follows. Faith itself is an anticipation. It anticipates what is actually still unattainable for us. This captures the heart of the matter. Through faith, man accepts the revelation of God and thus God himself. The Logos, the revelation of God, is unsurpassed knowledge, due reason, and meaning. And access to this knowledge is also of a different kind. In other words, faith is not primarily about academic knowledge. The reality that occurs in Christian revelation is nothing and no one other than Christ himself. He is, in the true sense, the revelation. Ratzinger says, whoever sees me, quotation John, sees the Father. Accordingly, receiving revelation is synonymous with entering into the reality of Christ. However, modern man finds this difficult. He is accustomed to thinking in abstract, academic, and often positivistic terms, which is made even more difficult by the reduction of reason. But this often closes the door to faith. Faith becomes possible when the believer enters into a living relationship with God, as expressed in the Gospel of John, which reads, "Now this is eternal life, that they should know you, the only true God, and the only whom you sent, Jesus Christ." Ultimately, faith is linked to a life decision that becomes reality when knowledge of truth and love meet. Ratzinger develops this theme based on a dialogical approach, especially since faith only becomes possible through entering into a relationship. Thus, faith is an anticipation of heaven, which is the perfect form of encounter. It is fulfilled in communion with God, the communion between God and man in the mystical body of Christ. Faith, reason, and relativism are topics that are of fundamental importance for faith and for the transmission of faith. And it is the great credit of Joseph Ratzinger and Benedict XVI that he has produced groundbreaking analyses and statements of these topics, which provide guidance on how the current crisis on faith can be overcome. Against the backdrop of the great challenges of our time, technical thinking and globalization, the first step must be to regain the breadth of reason. Reasonable means truthful. Relativism is an expression of weak and narrow-minded reasoning. It is based on the false pride that humans cannot recognize the truth and the false humility of refusing to accept it. The truth let us free, John 8:32, because it is the standard by which humans must measure themselves. Accepting it requires humility. Thus it becomes clear why the knowledge of truth cannot be a purely academic act. Man is not a computer that stores the truth like an algorithm. He is capable of truth and will find the truth if he conforms to the truth. And according to St. Thomas Aquinas, rectitudo, uprightness, precedes all virtues. Accordingly, in the long run, reason cannot be rightly guided if one's own life is in contradiction to the truth. Such an attitude leads to a debt and through which the foundation of faith are lost. Faith is forward-looking because it anticipates what is and what awaits us. And Christian faith is therefore the option that the unseen is more real than the seen. The Logos, the divine revelation, precedes all thought and contains that unsurpassed knowledge through which reason receives its dignity and life its meaning. And faith, therefore, means entering into a living relationship with God. And from this perspective, the danger posed by relativism as a mindset of modernity becomes clear. It acts like a creeping poison. Instead of setting out to face the liberating and at the same time challenging power of truth, man withdraws into his own self-sufficiency. This is fooled by the use of social media. At first glance, people rejoice, like Hans im Glück, because life becomes more comfortable and pleasant. In reality, however, this is precisely what prevents people from fulfilling their destiny, making them unfree. Relativism would cement such a mindset and in doing so create the social and legal conditions for the spiritual unfreedom of men. And yet precisely in this way, humanity risks missing its true global, to come to the knowledge of the truth, which is God, and thus to attain eternal life. Thank you for your attention.